Welcome to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast where innovation isn't just an ideal, it's a way of life. I'm your host and creator of the Innovate, Disrupt, or Die newsletter, Danny Nathan. Welcome, folks, to another episode of Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast. This week, I'm really excited. I have author Jason Voiovich here with me, who is an innovation historian, something that I have never run into before, and I'm really excited to learn more about. Jason, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time.
No, thanks for having me on, Danny. I really appreciate it. I'm excited. Obviously, I'm very excited to talk about innovation history and how it can help people trying to innovate now.
Perfect. Well, let's start off with the easy question, Jason. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, your relationship to the world of innovation, and how you ended up being an innovation historian.
Well, the first thing to know is I'm not a historian by training. I'm a practicing innovator, entrepreneur, and I'm a fractional chief product officer and chief marketing officer. So that's the first thing to know. I don't come at it from an academic perspective. I had to learn to be a historian. I have two of my own startups. I have several clients. And what I think about history and why I lean into that is instead of relying on my own experience or case studies I read, which are always a little bit biased and suffer from kind of survivorship bias, I get the kind of insight from hundreds of people throughout history who have had to innovate and who have had to make it work. And I can rely on all their experience, not only to help my own startups, but to help other people that I work with and other people who read my books. So I am very excited about it. I totally geek out on it. And I geek out on it because it works. It helps see things faster than other people do. We see patterns faster. That's what's really cool. Not kind of the sanitized ideas that should work, the real things that tend to work in the real world.
Right. And I'd imagine that with the breadth of examples that are floating around in your head that you have an easier time than most kind of pulling from those stories and those advantages to being able to recognize the patterns that you're describing.
I think most people, when they think about history and studying history, they think about it like, oh, I'm going to read Good to Great, or I'll read Malcolm Gladwell, or I'll read John Green or whatever. And there'll be stories in those books that are basically case studies. The problem with case studies, as we both know, and everyone listening to this should know, is that they are the sanitized, like after effect, trying to justify my past actions version of truth. Right. Not the real truth. Studying history is a really different thing. And what I had to learn about studying history, because that's what I thought, years ago when I started this. What studying history is really about, though, is primary source documents and actually going back to the inventor's notes and the things they were writing down at the time, newspaper articles that were written at the time. Those are the kind of sources that are important because you see the real things that happened and the real events and the real kind of troubles that people had along the way. Most case studies are kind of follow like this hero's journey story, like, they had a great idea, then there was a challenge, and then we succeeded. That's total BS. Like real stories don't work that way. So I see it as the difference between reading a market survey, if you're an innovator, and actually talking to customers. There's no real, yes, both are valuable, but there's no substitute for actually talking with your customers and seeing what they go through. If you don't know how to do that, or if you're not doing it, you shouldn't be innovating.
Obviously, you can't go back and talk to the historical figures, though, in the manner that you're describing. How do you solve for that? Like, how do you learn from history without the benefit of being able to talk to the innovator that you're learning about and without introducing the bias that you're describing that we see so much today in case studies?
Yeah, it's funny that you ask that. Most people think like, well, you can't go back and talk to them. Well, in a lot of cases, you almost can. And what I mean by that is if you go back, like for instance, Richard Drew, he was the inventor at 3M of masking tape and Scotch tape. Okay. Back in the 1930s. Well,
wow, I didn't realize that was that old.
It's old. Yeah, it's a really old idea. It's a really cool story. And I was really fascinated with it in my latest book. And I read all of the After Effects stuff and the kind of the corporate histories of it. And they all seemed really dry. They all followed that kind of hero's journey sort of thing. Like, oh, he had an idea, there was a problem, and then he succeeded. Like, it couldn't have happened that way. Like, I just know instinctively it didn't happen that way. What's really cool is if you go to the 3M archives, they have all inventors at 3M or other big companies like that, and they weren't so big back then, they have their papers. So for a lot of these historical innovators, they have actual notes, like things that like Richard Drew wrote down, like, here are the tests that I ran. I'm talking to this guy today, and he told me X. And you can look at like how frustrated he was. He has like notes in the margins that say like, well, that didn't work. When you read them, it's actually like he's talking to you because he's writing notes to himself. Right. And all inventors and people like that tend to be really good note takers. They write journals. They have to take notes because a lot of times, if you think about it, they're trying to get a patent, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're trying to get a patent, you have to keep your notes on what was in there. Like every inventor and engineer I've met at any company of any size has to keep a patent journal because the lawyers will ask, when did you write that down? You need to write the date you drew that idea so that when they go to file an application, let's say someone beats them to it, they can pull up your notebook and the lawyers can say, hey, on April 15th, 2021, Danny had this drawing and that predates your drawing, which means we have prior art, which means you can't patent it.
Wow. Okay.
So if you look at...
It's like the historical version of going back through my Fireflies notes for all my meetings, essentially.
But that's really the idea. And there are lots of things that, if you can't get that, and sometimes you can't get that, but you can get newspaper articles and people who are giving interviews at that time. So when I was researching Coco Chanel, she's a fashion designer for those for the
uninitiated.
Yeah, for the uninitiated, the men in your audience who probably don't know. She's a huge fashion designer. And one of her innovations was like, how do you get people to look at your clothes? She figured out, she went to around France. She hired beautiful people, mostly women, dressed them in her clothes and walked them up and down the street. It was the first runway. It was like driving people back to her showroom where people would see in the windows, hear all her fashions, and they would come in and buy. So there were lots of times where a journalist would interview her about that and she would talk about it. And yes, that's always a little bit of a filtered version of reality, right? You're trying to kind of put on a show, and Coco Chanel was a fantastic showwoman. But it's so close to the event that you're not looking at kind of survivorship bias, like, hey, 20 years later, someone's reflecting on how they did something 20 years ago. Right. That doesn't really tell you much. And that's what most case studies are written by. They're just too far separated from the events. Hey, you want to be a historian yourself, or you want to start to really think about how this inventor did something, go to Google and search for articles written at the time. So journalists who wrote like, hey, I really want to study the iPhone, for instance, that's a big thing. Don't read Walter Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs. Go back and read Wired articles from 2007. And see, what did journalists actually think about it? What did Steve Jobs say in response to interviews? Really read what people were saying, because what you'll discover is how much of a downer it really was. Now we think like, oh, well, this is this kind of watershed moment. How could anyone question how great that was? Well, I'll tell you, at the time, there was a lot of questioning. And very, very few people thought it was a good idea. And it was interesting to read kind of how public was reacting, because there are a lot of innovators today who feel that, okay, if I get a little bit of bad press or people are pushing back, that it's a dead idea and like, hey, I'm not getting good feedback, kill the idea and hit the ripcord. Okay, maybe. But good initial press isn't necessarily indicative of future innovation success. What really is, how many people were standing out in front of an Apple store on the day it was released?
Oh, I've been one of those guys waiting in line at the Apple store. I remember how long those lines got.
Those were crazy. Those were crazy times.
Jason, I want to circle back to the 3M archive. Is that, and this is purely because I'm curious and you brought it up, but I'm assuming that the 3M archive is probably a physical archive in Wilmington. Oh no, that's DuPont. Sorry, a physical archive at 3M's offices. Like, did you get permission to go in and explore this in Minneapolis?
Here's the trick. What's really cool about these archives is, yes, many of them are physically located on campuses and in large organizations. Most of the time, like a 3M or a large company like DuPont, for instance, I think gave everything to Duke University, and Duke manages the archive. What's really cool is you can go to the papers of this person, or you can go to Duke's archives or the University of Minnesota or whomever, wherever. And lots of the results are digitized, totally available. Like you can go in online. Cool. In many cases, you don't even need an account. You go in, you look for the thing you want, you search for the thing you want, and you can actually see on your screen, like, here are the actual notes and they're scanned. So it used to be 20 years ago, you had to travel to Minneapolis, or the Minnesota History Museum has a lot of them, where you'd have to go in, you'd have to physically go, you set up an appointment, and you actually would go into a photography room where you would be given gloves and you'd have to take out the thing and you could photograph it, and then you could take it. You had to register it as a researcher. The whole deal. It was really hard.
Jason, you've mentioned a couple of times now, the books that you've worked on. Tell me a little bit more about your books. I have one of them on my shelf here that I'm thoroughly looking forward to reading, but I want to hear it from you directly. Tell us more about what you've researched and what you've discovered and shared with the world.
Well, the most recent book is called Bullfrogs, Bingo, and the Little House on the Prairie: How Innovators of the Great Depression Made the Best of the Worst of Times.
Okay. Jason, say that one again for me a little bit slower, because it's a great title, but it's a mouthful.
Yeah. Bullfrogs, Bingo, and the Little House on the Prairie: How Innovators of the Great Depression Made the Best of the Worst of Times. And It's funny, the prior book on the 1920s, I was working with an advertising friend of mine, and he's like, gosh, it's just about booze and Babe Ruth, and like, you should just call it Booze and Babe. And so the first book, Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress was the name of the first book. And then when the second one, I'm working on a trilogy in the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, kind of that rise of consumer culture in the United States. Really fascinating era. And I'm like, wow, I'm kind of backed myself into a corner. With the title.
Have you started thinking about the title for the third one? Because it sounds like you've got
good. Yeah, that was before I settled on the title for the second one. I had to make sure I had a title for the third one too. So I'm good. It's about the warriors. But this is all about my style in writing this. It's story driven. So there are 21 stories of innovators in that book, in Bullfrogs. And it's all about how everyday people turned lemons into lemonade. And it wasn't just about like, hey, they survived hardships. They created a lot of the products, services, entertainment that we still enjoy now. So the whole narrative about the Great Depression was, well, it was big and it was depressing. And we often forget, and innovators are good at recognizing this usually, but bad times make for great innovation.
Yes.
Because necessity is the mother of invention. We are in a stressful period. How many companies were born of the Great Recession? Things like Uber, Square, Smashburger. A ton of companies were founded during the Great Recession. Every major recession has launched incredible companies. The Great Depression was no exception to that. And the Great Depression was way longer and way worse than any of those. So we had tons of things that came out of that really changed our lives.
Jason, you're focused on a time period that I think as innovators, we don't really consider as readily in terms of examples. You ask somebody for an example of great innovation and inevitably you get Kodak invented the digital camera and sat on it for 20 years. You get the usual Netflix, destroyed Blockbuster and all of that. What are some of the really inspiring examples that came out of the period that you've spent so much time studying that we just don't think about?
Yeah, let's take Kodak for a second. In the 1930s, Leopold Godowsky and Leopold Mans, they were both named Leopold, by the way. They were concert musicians, concert pianists, classical musicians who invented Kodachrome, the color photography film in the 1930s. I had
no idea.
And what was funny is George Eastman, who most people know, founded Kodak, launched the Brownie in 1900, 1901, somewhere in there, which was the first camera we would recognize as a point-and-shoot camera. Right. You get to the Great Depression, Godowsky and Mans didn't introduce Kodachrome with Kodak until 1937. Camera sales exploded during the Great Depression. They really increased during that time because people were looking for a cheap form of entertainment that, they wanted to document their lives. There was a lot of upheaval. People wanted to show it and talk about it. And, so camera sales were going up. If you think about a camera is a three-part system. Hardware, which is the camera itself, software, which is film, and then the service, which is development. Okay. And the camera hardware had been improving during the Great Depression. Lots of innovation, including cameras you could put in your shirt pocket, like really small ones, really cool ones. Those are introduced in the mid-1930s, the worst years of the Great Depression. People were coming out with like mini cameras, which were really cool. So the hardware was improving. Development was improving too. It used to be where you had to send your photos or your film. You'd put the film in the little case and you'd send it to Kodak, and Kodak would develop it. Well, drugstores and other places got into the business of developing photos because it was really profitable, like really, really profitable. But if you think about the third leg in the stool there, the software really hadn't improved much. It was black and white, obviously, so single color. And that was pretty much it. So there wasn't really a software innovation in that three-part system. Kodachrome was essentially a software innovation. It came out in 1937 and blew the lid off cameras. What was really cool, and we forget about timing as an important thing. Kodak in 1937 gave away, I think the number is 250,000 cameras to anyone who turned 12 years old in that year. Like a birthday. It was kind of like a birthday present. Yeah. So they gave away tens of thousands of cameras to kids and introduced color film at the same time. You had hundreds of thousands of little kids out with their first camera and color film, taking pictures of stuff. It really changed the world. That's one of those inspiring stories. And people think like, well, yeah, how long did it take Godowsky and Mans to come up with that idea and work with it? They began working on their version of that in 1917.
Oh my God. So it took them 20 years to actually get to production.
Years to get to production. They started basically in their basement. They're classical musicians. Their wives were involved in the process. So the four of them were kind of working on it. Now, what was really cool, another thing that's cool about timing and about just serendipity, people think like, oh, I don't know a whole lot about this field. I can't innovate in this because I don't know. Well, BS. They did. Yeah. They're classical musicians, and Godowsky and Mans were on a ship to Europe to do a concert because they're still classical musicians. And who's on the boat with them? The folks at Cum Loeb, basically a competitor to JP Morgan, were sitting there, financiers. So they're like, hey, they're musicians. They're talking it up with the people, with the people around. The folks at Cum Loeb are like, they love the classical music. They wanted to talk to the musicians. They're having drinks. They're like, hey, we're working on a thing. And they showed them, like, here are some of our prototypes for this color, film process. But we really need some help. We need some money to kind of help us continue to do it. Cum Loeb, when they got back, they went back to their New York kind of apartment where they were working on it and wrote them a check to keep them going. And then Cum Loeb introduced them to George Eastman.
So they were effectively kind of the first VC, if you will. They were funding the early effort and then making all the wow, that is so interesting. All right, maybe I missed this, Jason, but do you know why the two classical musicians were pursuing the creation of color film to begin with? What was their interest in it?
Well, the trigger was they were kind of Renaissance guys. Back in those days, you didn't have that same kind of warped anti-generalist mindset. Yeah. So they were, in addition to classically trained musicians, they were also both trained chemists. And they enjoyed it and they enjoyed tinkering. But what was the trigger? They watched the very first kind of color movie. It just had red and green. That was the color. So it was like, you'd think like that'd make it festive, but it really just made everyone look like the zombie apocalypse.
I was about to say, it sounds brown.
It was not good. It was no good at all. The movie title was Old Navy, and it was kind of like this nautical tale sort of thing. They watched it in 1917 and are like, this is awful. We can do better than this. And they came up with pretty quickly, they had essentially a working alpha prototype. They had a 3-color process, red, green, blue. But it was really like every time you wanted to develop something, you had to be kind of tweaking the chemistry every time. It was just, there was no way to replicate or scale that process. Really, what took the 20 years was figuring out how to make that so that some 12-year-old could snap a photo, send off the film, and it would come back in color. That was the hard part. The idea wasn't the hard part. It was how to create this at scale. And
interesting.
It could take a long time.
It was almost the commercialization aspect of it. I mean,
correct.
Okay. Super interesting.
Yeah, it's one example of kind of technical innovation that, the commercialization was important, the timing was important, the connections with financiers are important. Kind of the boring stuff that I have found has become really important. People talk about the technology, or they talk about like, what new agent are you going to build, or what like crypto, like 3 years ago it was what crypto thing you were going to do. What I found is, okay, well, what matters? The boring stuff matters. Timing matters. Ecosystems matter. Channels matter. Financial support matters. Grit matters. Those are the sort of thing. Ideas are cheap. It is the execution of those ideas over time that really makes the difference. And I think it is important. One of the things I wanted to do with the book is I wanted to show today's innovators that these things are tough. I talk a lot about the people and what made them tick, because that ultimately wasn't really the idea in a lot of cases. It was how they stuck with and executed it in the face of not just like one like hero's journey failure, multiple failures, multiple trials. And I think most of the time people think like, oh, well, everything that Steve Jobs touched was gold. Well, not only is that not true, but it wasn't true ever. So I think it's important to remember that like, hey, this is going to be hard. It's worth the effort. The payoff is worth it, but you got to stick with it. And here's what to focus on versus like, hey, what, kind of what's the tech in there? Yeah, that's important, but that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Right. So interesting. You mentioned that you run a couple of your own startups, you advise other companies and consult with other companies on their product and innovation efforts. How does your knowledge and your perspective of the history of innovation come to bear or impact the work that you do in your startups, or the manner in which you advise others?
What I appreciate in my own startups, and what I think others appreciate from that perspective, is that yes, there's a grit angle to it. There's a perspective. I think there's that calm confidence that comes from understanding a broad arc of history that brought us to this point, kind of on the shoulders of all the giants that we step on that help support us in this process. And I think that many innovation coaches and approaches all kind of go for hey, here's the one thing to focus on. And those things sound really good. Simplicity is very, very compelling. The problem is that what I've learned over studying innovation over the arc of better than 150 years is that simplicity is the outgrowth of respecting complexity and really kind of leaning into it. The Navy SEALs call it embrace the suck.
Yeah.
Where like you are going to put the work in, you are going to explore all the angles, you're going to work on the boring stuff, the timing, the ecosystems, the structure, the channels, the financing. You're going to work on all of those different angles. And the customer, they are only going to look at that one thing that matters to them. Yet you need to keep all of that complexity behind the scenes. You can't oversimplify your end. By understanding that, you know what to simplify for your end customer. That's the point. You need to balance those two things. And that's not a sexy message. It's not something that's going to be on the title of a New York Times best-selling book. That's just not how it works. People like simple answers. I totally get it. But as an innovator, simplicity is for talking with your customer. The innovative process, you must embrace the complexity of it. That it is complex. There are a lot of things going on, and it's really a lot more like conducting an orchestra than, playing one instrument.
Right.
And you have to love it. You have to love all of that stuff. That's what'll make you successful. That's what made all of the people successful that I've profiled, is they loved all the details. They really did. They were able to simplify it for their customer, but they just love the nitty-gritty details. For instance, I tell the story in this book. There's Coco Chanel in the previous one. In this book is Madeline Vionnet, and much fewer people have talked about her. But she invented, like if you look at the movie stars of the 1930s and the dresses that women wore during that time, they were like these form-fitting, beautiful dresses that were like, wow, like how could you get something to kind of mold to the body like that?
Mm-hmm.
She invented a type of stitching and cut. She basically reinvented how dresses were constructed at the fabric level so that she could pull that off. She understood fabric. She understood traveling to understand how the fabrics were made, how to cut them, how to restitch them, how to market them, just that entire ecosystem. And it was important. All of that could have been done decades before, but it wasn't. What made it important was in the 1930s, you had the big screen. Like movies became super popular. If you've got bad fitting clothes on a screen that's 20 feet high, you notice.
Yeah.
So it was timing that was just critical for that particular innovation. Otherwise, it probably would have fallen flat, even done 10 years before.
Jason, there's something else that I kind of want to hit on. Obviously, we've talked a lot here, and, you've spent what I presume is years studying innovation. I'm curious what your perspective on disruption is and how it relates to innovation.
It's interesting that if you were to ask them, did they think they were disrupting an industry, they wouldn't have thought about it that way. They were obsessed with solving a problem and bringing something new into the market. Most of them are just absolutely obsessed about who their customer was and what they wanted and what they weren't getting. That's what they were obsessed about. If that disrupted an industry, awesome. But that just didn't really enter their mind. And I know that because I've read their own notes.
Right.
Like they just didn't talk about it. It just wasn't something they thought about. The only one that I think fit that mold was Robert Wood, who took over Sears in the 1920s and converted really from the catalog business, the really innovative catalog business, to the first big box stores. Sears created the first big box stores. And what he saw happening was in the 1920s, people were moving to the suburbs. So people wanted better schools, they wanted more space, and they were kind of moving into these in-between areas called suburbs. They were the first ones in the 1920s. So he actually worked for Montgomery Ward at the time, conceived of the idea of a box store where you would go in and the product would be out and you just take it like you go to a Walmart or a Target today. He brought the idea to Montgomery Ward and said, this is how we're going to basically dominate the market. And they told him to kind of take a hike. We're competing with Sears on this catalog business. We're going to drive their catalog into the ground. Well, he went over to Sears and Sears said, yeah, we'll do that. And because we want to drive Montgomery Ward out of business. So yes, there are some innovators like that are definitely thinking of it more of in a modern disruption, sort of like, hey, here are the market dynamics and here's what's going on. But I will tell you that most innovators at their core who were successful were just obsessed with their customer and their customer's problem. And I think that's really at the heart of disruption. Is yes, there is a market dynamic, but I find too many innovators, in my opinion, focus too much on the market, not enough on their customer.
Yes. I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem across the board. I mean,
100%.
Not even if you're focused on innovation, but regardless of what you're focused on, if you are creating a product, the need for obsession with the customer and the problem that you can solve for them is really what kind of drives success.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, just story after story after story. Really, like what is notably absent in the stories that I tell are, well, what was the competitor doing at this time? Because it just was largely irrelevant, because what was really happening, the true nature of the innovation was so unique, so different, meeting such an unmet need, that the competitive set was either non-existent or so inferior that people would adopt a clearly inferior product, because it met a need that was completely unmet at the time. So
All right, I have to jump in for a second here,
yeah.
Jason. I'm sorry to cut you off, but what you've just described then is almost literally, by definition, disruption. And what I'm hearing you say is they weren't thinking about disruption because it was so deeply ingrained in the need to solve the problem at hand that they didn't need to think about it. It was just inherent in what they were doing.
I couldn't agree more. I think that is my definition of disruption. What I find most people, I'd say a lot of journalists, a lot of bloggers, a lot of coaches, unfortunately, when they talk about disruption, they're talking about market disruption. Like, oh, well, here's this competitive set. And it's almost like a war game kind of scenario. Okay, well, I want like a game theory thing. Like, well, if they do this, we'll do this. And here's how we kind of outflank them. Like, that's nice. I think we're talking about different things.
It's so funny that you point that out. The very first guest that I had on this podcast is a good friend of mine. His name is JT. And as we were sort of bantering back and forth, he said to me, I hate the word disruption. And we started talking about it. And his example was, take a look at Canva. Canva didn't disrupt Adobe, for example. Adobe still has a very healthy business. Canva just went out and created a product that appealed to the 170 million people that Adobe ignored because they were not, quote, professional designers. And that moment in that conversation really got me thinking, and I won't spend a ton of time rehashing because I've written about it a couple of times now. So if you're listening and you're curious, please go dig into the archives of Innovate, Disrupt, or Die. But I've written a couple of times now around, what exactly is disruption? And does somebody have to lose in order for a disruptor to win? And at least in my opinion, the conclusion that I've come to is it's not about a company winning or losing. It's about changing the perspective of the expectations of the market. The market as defined by Adobe was software for designers needs to be expensive, intensely powerful, and service this kind of niche professional market. And Canva just went out and said, yeah, we just completely disagree with the premise.
Exactly. I would tell you in each of these, there are 21 stories in this book, and in Booze, Babe in the Little Black Dress, there are 26.
Okay.
In no case was there a winner and a loser. There were only winners. There were only expansions of the market. Right. There wasn't masking tape or Scotch tape before Drew. That was a new market. It was a new need. It was new stuff that people hadn't done before.
Right.
They weren't displacing glue. There's still a market for glue, and now there's tape. It created a new market. I think the best example of that is how Americans started to bring pets into their homes, like dogs and cats. And I've seen your dog walk back and forth back there.
Yeah, he's sitting right here bugging me now, but yeah, he's been running around in the background.
Well, it's funny that what most people don't realize is before the 1930s, we didn't really have pets. I mean, rich people had pets, but most middle-class people didn't have companion animals, dogs or cats around. That was something that market created itself during that time. What really triggered it? A huge amount of psychological stress. The 1930s was really psychologically stressful, as you could probably guess. I mean, remember the Great Recession, living through that was no fun. The pandemic was no fun. Huge amount of stress. Well, imagine that going on for more than a decade.
Yeah.
And imagine what's one of the number one things that a doctor would tell you to do if you're really stressed out? Go pet a dog. Go for a walk, and ideally go for a walk with a dog, or kind of sit on the couch with a cat. There is demonstrated evidence now, we've researched it for decades now, that pets tend to calm people down. They tend to improve people's mental health. Well, there wasn't research on that in the 1930s. People just knew it. They understood it. And they brought these pets into their home that created huge market opportunities for all kinds of other stuff, like pet food, for instance, like kibble was invented in 1930. So the dog needed something to eat. Kibble comes onto the scene, so it's dry, shelf-stable food for the dog. Awesome. Well, okay, the dog is in the house. Great. Vets became super popular. Totally not price sensitive, by the way. Because remember, what happened in the 1920s to make vets under stress? Horses went away.
Mm-hmm.
So now you have cars, you got a whole bunch of vets in the city with nothing to do that started to set up shop for dogs and cats because they had to, necessity being the mother of invention. Not only were vets a big deal, but people were buying clothes for their pets, toys for their pets, all kinds of stuff spiked during the Great Depression. People bought stuff for their new family members. This is the first time in American culture where the family, as we defined it, didn't only have to include humans. So when you think about what happened, and then what was kind of the timing in the ecosystem? Remember those kind of boring things like what's going on out there? How do you kind of fit into something that is changing and happening right now? Imagine being a toy manufacturer in the 1930s, figuring out how you make what do I do? Sales are down. And you notice, I wonder if we can make toys for dogs.
Right.
And you start making toys for dogs and your sales spike. This is the sort of observation and curiosity that true innovators really look for. They are observant, they're curious, they're obsessed with, the world around them. You'll find a way to make it work.
Yeah.
You'll absolutely find a way to make it work. It's just so inspiring.
It really is. And I'm now even more looking forward to reading your books.
You'll like it. It'll be fun.
I'm quite certain it will because I'm having a ton of fun just hearing about it. So is there anything that I haven't asked that you're just dying to share that would really sort of put a fine point in our conversation here?
Gosh, I would just say that you can do it. That's maybe the biggest thing. I meet a lot of innovators who really admit to me after they kind of have a little bit of their bluster. And then they admit I don't know. I feel like it's never going to work. I'm so frustrated. And right beneath the surface, they have so much doubt. And what I want to show, and that's maybe the biggest thing that has changed my perspective on innovation in researching all of these people and really telling their stories, not mine, has been, they got through it. You will too. You can do this. You can make this work. If you love it, you'll figure it out. And people need examples of hey, here are people just like you, and here's how they figured it out. And not this was Steve Jobs or Jeff Bezos or Martha Stewart. Richard Drew was a banjo player from St. Paul, Minnesota, who dropped out of college, dropped out of an engineering program in college at the University of Minnesota, and cold called his way to William McKnight at 3M to ask for a job. And they put him on the road selling sandpaper.
Wow.
That's his story. He was a failed banjo player and college dropout.
Amazing. Jason, once more, remind us of the titles of your books so that people can go and find them now that we've talked about them.
Yeah, you can go find them on Amazon. There are no other titles like them, which I think is the best way to do this.
Of course.
The book about the Roaring Twenties is Booze, Babe, and the Little Black Dress, How Innovators of the Roaring Twenties Created the Consumer Revolution. And its follow-up is Bullfrogs Bingo and the Little House on the Prairie, How Innovators of the Great Depression Made the Best of the Worst of Times. They are available in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. I narrate them myself. Check them out on Amazon. I am available on LinkedIn. I am like Tigger. I'm the only one. So you find a Jason Voiovich. It is me. Connect with me. Reach out. That's fine. JasonTVoiovich.com is my personal website. I'm not hard to find online. If you're an innovator, I want to connect with you. Simple as that.
Awesome. And Jason, should folks read the books in order, or are they standalone enough in terms of the individual stories that you can benefit regardless?
Yeah, not only are the books standalone enough, they're thematic. I think you'll get the themes.
Sure.
But each chapter is standalone.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been an absolute pleasure and really exciting to hear your perspective and your depth of knowledge on all things innovation and history. So thank you. I really appreciate your time.
No, thank you for having me, Danny. Appreciate it.
That's it for today. Thanks for tuning in to Innovate, Disrupt, or Die, the podcast. Join us again for our next episode, and don't forget to subscribe at innovatedisruptordie.com. That's all, folks.